Sarah Elisabeth Miller was not like most 9-year-olds in her small town of Willow Creek. While other children rushed out to play hopscotch on cracked sidewalks or spent afternoons glued to cartoons, Sarah carried a small, leather-bound notebook wherever she went. Its cover was scratched and worn from constant use, its pages filled with questions, sketches, and observations that only she seemed to care about. Sarah's parents often watched her with both pride and quiet amusement. "That girl of ours doesn't just see the world. She studies it," her father, Daniel, would often say as he leaned against the kitchen counter, sipping his coffee. Her mother, Ruth, would smile and nod. "She has eyes like a detective. Sometimes I think she notices more than we do." And it was true. Sarah noticed everything. When other children looked at a butterfly, they admired its colors and chased it across the yard. Sarah crouched down, tilting her head, and whispered questions to herself. Why does it land on that flower and not the other? How does it know where to go? Does it feel tired when it flies too long? Then she'd sketch its wings into her notebook and write possible answers in neat, uneven handwriting. At school, Sarah was equally curious, though not always in the way teachers expected. In science class, when the lesson was about the water cycle, she didn't just memorize the diagram. She raised her hand and asked, "But what happens if the water is dirty before it evaporates? Does the dirt go into the clouds too?" Some children giggled at her question, but her teacher, Mrs. Harding, smiled kindly. "That's a very good question, Sarah. Sometimes we don't always think about the small details, but they matter." Sarah beamed, though she wasn't satisfied. That afternoon, she went home and left a bowl of muddy water by the window to see what would happen when the sun hit it. Her notebook became her treasure. On one page, she drew the family's old oak tree and wrote, "Why do the leaves fall when they look so healthy? Does the tree get tired of holding them?" On another page, she wrote about her little brother's laughter. "Does laughter make you stronger? He never cries when he laughs a lot." To anyone else, these seemed like childish ramblings, but for Sarah, they were seeds of discovery. She didn't just want to learn what was already written in books. She wanted to find out things no one had noticed. Most days after school, Sarah preferred walking home alone, dragging her feet slowly so she could observe things along the way. She would stop to watch ants building lines across the pavement or to count how many sparrows sat on the electric wires. One particular autumn afternoon, the golden sunlight fell through the trees as Sarah walked home. She noticed the air smelled faintly sour near the old factory on the edge of town. Wrinkling her nose, she jotted down in her notebook, "Factory smells bad. Why, no workers inside, maybe something left behind." She circled it twice. Sarah didn't know then that this little note would one day lead to something far bigger than she could imagine. At dinner, Sarah often overwhelmed her parents with questions. "Dade," she asked one evening as she poked at her mashed potatoes, "if you plant two seeds side by side, do they talk to each other under the ground?" Her father chuckled. "Talk to each other? Plants don't talk, sweetheart." "But maybe they do," Sarah insisted, her wide brown eyes shining. "Maybe not with words like us, but with something we don't understand yet. Maybe they share food or warn each other." Her mother placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "You have such a beautiful mind, Sarah. Don't ever stop asking." That encouragement lit a spark in Sarah's heart. To her, questions weren't signs of not knowing. They were paths to hidden truths. Other children sometimes teased Sarah for being too serious. They called her Professor or Miss Y. At first it hurt. She would sit quietly at recess, watching the others play tag while clutching her notebook. But soon she discovered that while they ran in circles, she was exploring circles of thought that reached far beyond the playground. She once told her best friend Emma, "One day the things I write here will matter. Maybe not now, but someday." Emma had only shrugged, not really understanding, but Sarah meant it with all her heart. Her curiosity wasn't just about objects and creatures, it was about people too. She noticed when her mother seemed tired even before she admitted it, or when her teacher forced a smile after receiving a phone call. Sarah asked questions that sometimes startled adults. "Are you sad today? Why do grown-ups pretend they're fine when they're not? Adults often dismissed her with a gentle laugh, but Sarah's persistence grew stronger each time she felt unheard. It was this persistence, born from her natural curiosity, that would later push her to uncover something that science and experts initially overlooked. On that autumn walk near the factory, Sarah didn't just smell the sour air. She noticed how the grass looked patchy and yellow, how the birds never perched near the fence anymore, and how her friend Jenny, who lived closest to the area, was always coughing. Most 9-year-olds would have shrugged and hurried home for snacks or playtime, but Sarah stopped, bent down, ran her fingers through the dry soil, and thought, "Something isn't right here. I don't know what it is yet, but I'll find out." She closed her notebook with determination. And so, at just 9 years old, Sarah Elisabeth Miller unknowingly began a journey that would soon reveal a dark secret hidden in plain sight, one that even trained scientists had failed to notice. The air in Willow Creek had always smelled of pine and clean rain, but Sarah Elisabeth Miller noticed that something changed on her walks home from school. It was subtle at first, a soreness that lingered near the old factory road, a metallic taste that seemed to catch in her throat. Other children rushed past without caring, but Sarah slowed her steps, nose wrinkled, pencil poised over her notebook. She scribbled, "Strange smell, like rotten eggs and rust. Near factory. Stronger when it rains." Sarah had never known the factory to be anything but an abandoned gray building. Her father once told her it had closed before she was even born. Yet every time she passed it, she felt uneasy. The cracked windows glared like hollow eyes, and the tall chimney stood like a silent warning. It wasn't just the smell that made her suspicious. She began noticing something odd about her classmates. Jenny, who lived closest to the factory, coughed so often during lessons that Mrs. Harding sent her to the nurse almost daily. Tom, who used to outrun everyone at recess, had grown slower, sometimes too tired to join in at all. Even Emma, Sarah's best friend, admitted one day, "I keep getting headaches. Mama says it's just the weather, but..." She trailed off, rubbing her temples. Sarah listened carefully. Her small fingers tightened around her pencil as she whispered, "It can't just be the weather. The weather doesn't make only kids near the factory sick." That night, she wrote in her notebook, "Jenny, Tom, Emma, all sick. They live near factory. Is there a connection?" Determined to look closer, Sarah changed her route home the next afternoon. Instead of walking straight past, she slipped quietly through the rusty gate that leaned crooked against its hinges. The ground inside was uneven, scattered with broken bottles and scraps of metal. Then she saw it, a wide patch of grass, completely yellow and brittle, surrounded by healthy green weeds. Sarah crouched, brushing her fingers across the dry blades. The soil beneath crumbled like ash between her fingers. She frowned, jotting down quickly, "Grass dead in circle. Rest around fine. Why only here? Poison in ground." As she wrote, she felt a chill. Something was wrong, something no one was paying attention to. At dinner she brought it up carefully. "Dade, why do you think grass would die in just one spot, like a big circle?" Her father looked puzzled. "Could be the soil. Sometimes land gets worn out. But what if it's not natural? What if something made it that way?" Her mother sighed gently. "Sweetheart, you shouldn't wander near that factory. It's not safe." "But Mama," Sarah insisted, "people are getting sick and the ground is strange. Don't you think someone should check?" Her father patted her hand, trying to reassure her. "Leave that to the grown-ups, Sarah. You're just a child. Don't worry so much." Yet Sarah did worry. She couldn't shake the thought that the adults were blind to something important. When the school announced its annual science fair, Sarah knew what her project would be. She collected soil samples in small jars, one from her backyard, one from the park, and one from the patch near the factory. On the day of the fair, she set up her display with careful notes, sketches, and her jars. She titled it, "What's in the Soil?" When the judges approached, Sarah explained, "I found this patch near the factory where the grass is dead. The soil is dry, and it smells strange. I think it might be making people sick. My friends who live close to the factory are unwell more often than others." The judges glanced at the jars and smiled politely. One of them chuckled softly. "That's very observant, young lady. But soil can die for many reasons. Maybe you should focus on plants or something simpler next time." Her cheeks flushed, but she stood tall. "But I think this matters. Don't you think it's worth checking?" The judges nodded vaguely and moved on. Sarah's project didn't win any prize that year. Still, she felt a flicker of pride. She had spoken her truth even if no one listened. Over the weeks, Sarah's observations grew. She noticed fewer birds around the area. The factory fence seemed oddly quiet, with no squirrels or stray dogs roaming nearby. Even the stream that trickled behind it, once clear and lively, now had a greasy film that reflected rainbow colors under the sun. She bent down to touch the water one day, but pulled back quickly, shaking her hand. It left a faint chemical smell on her skin. She added another note: stream dirty, rainbow colors bad. Why not clean water anymore? The realization made her heart pound. If the water was poisoned, then everything near it, plants, animals, people, could be suffering. Sarah tried to tell others. She told Mrs. Harding, who gave her a sympathetic smile but said gently, "Sometimes things seem worse when we pay too much attention, Sarah." "Maybe it's nothing," she told Emma, who wanted to believe her but shrugged helplessly. "Even if it's true, what can we do? We're just kids." She even wrote a letter to the town newspaper, though she never knew if anyone read it. The more she tried to speak up, the more alone she felt. But her notebook kept growing thicker, page after page filled with her observations. One evening, as Sarah sat by her window under the pale glow of the streetlight, she flipped through her notes. Every page told the same story: dead grass, sick children, strange smells, poisoned water. The evidence was there even if no one believed her yet. Tears stung her eyes, but she whispered to herself, "I can't stop. If I stop, who will notice? If I don't care, who will?" At just 9 years old, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility pressing on her small shoulders. She didn't have the tools of scientists, nor the authority of adults. All she had was her notebook, her questions, and her determination. But sometimes that is enough. And so, the strange discovery that everyone else overlooked became Sarah's mission. A mission that would soon shake her entire town and prove that even the smallest voice, if persistent enough, could uncover the darkest secrets. The town of Willow Creek prided itself on its small community and old traditions. When people thought of science, they pictured polished labs in faraway cities, not the cracked notebooks of a 9-year-old girl. So when Sarah Elisabeth Miller tried to raise concerns about the factory soil and sick children, she quickly discovered that truth was not always welcomed, especially when it came from a child. One Monday morning, Sarah arrived at school earlier than usual. She clutched her notebook so tightly that her fingers left smudges on its cover. When Mrs. Harding unlocked the classroom, Sarah stepped forward. "Mrs. Harding," she said earnestly, "I need to show you something. It's important." The teacher set her bag down, clearly tired from the start of another long week. "What is it, Sarah?" Sarah flipped to the pages filled with sketches of yellow grass, notes about her coughing classmates, and drawings of the oily stream. "Look, I've been watching near the factory. People are getting sick, and the ground doesn't look right. I think something dangerous is there." Mrs. Harding glanced at the pages. Her eyebrows rose slightly, but then she exhaled. "Sarah, this is very observant, but sometimes children can imagine patterns that aren't really there. Factories close down all the time. If there were something harmful, scientists or the government would have told us." Sarah's small fists clenched. But what if they didn't see it? What if nobody looked? Mrs. Harding knelt to meet her eyes. "I admire your curiosity, but let's not worry everyone with guesses. Why don't you keep your notes for the science club? Maybe we can explore soil health together in class." Her words were kind, but Sarah could hear the dismissal behind them. Her heart sank, but she nodded anyway. Sarah refused to stop. A week later, she convinced her mother to take her to the community center, where a retired chemist named Dr. Lewis gave free talks about science. Sarah waited until the end, notebook clutched in her hands. "Dr. Lewis," she began shyly, "can I show you something?" The older man adjusted his glasses, intrigued by the seriousness in her voice. "Of course, young lady. Sarah spread her notes across the table, explaining every detail. The smells, the sick children, the dead grass, the rainbow water. She spoke quickly, afraid he might cut her off. When she finished, Dr. Lewis scratched his chin. "You have a sharp eye. That's impressive for your age, but soil conditions vary naturally. Rusty pipes can cause smells. Migraines and coughs can come from weather or colds. But all at once, all near the factory." Sarah pressed, her voice trembling with urgency. The scientist hesitated. "Well, even if you are right, proper testing requires equipment, microscopes, chemical analysis. That's beyond what you can do." Sarah looked down at her notebook. "So you think it's nothing?" "I'm saying," Dr. Lewis replied gently, "it may not be as serious as it looks. Don't carry the world on your shoulders, little one. Science takes time." His words, though meant to comfort, felt heavy, like a door quietly closing. The final straw came when Sarah wrote a letter to the town council. Her father had laughed kindly when he saw her licking the envelope. "You're persistent. I'll give you that," he said, ruffling her hair. 2 weeks later, Sarah received a polite response printed on official letterhead. "Dear Miss Miller, thank you for your enthusiasm and concern. The old factory site was inspected years ago and deemed safe. Please rest assured that there is no reason for worry. Keep up your interest in science. It may lead to great things one day." Sarah crumpled the paper in her small hands. To her, the words were clear: "We don't believe you. We don't care." For the first time, Sarah felt utterly alone. She sat by her bedroom window that night, staring out at the distant silhouette of the factory. Its chimney loomed in the moonlight like a giant finger pointing at the sky. She whispered to herself, "Why won't they listen? Why doesn't science have an answer? Isn't that what it's supposed to do? Find the truth?" Tears slipped down her cheeks. She wasn't crying because she doubted herself. She cried because she felt powerless. What use were notebooks and questions if no one took them seriously? But even in her despair, something stirred inside her, a small flame of defiance. The next morning, she returned to the yellow patch of grass with a small plastic spoon and 3 jars. She dug soil samples carefully, labeling them with tape: factory patch, playground soil, backyard sample. She had no lab, but she had her determination. At home, she poured water into each jar and sniffed them. The one from the factory smelled sharp and bitter. She scribbled it all down. She didn't understand chemistry, but she understood difference. Something was not right. And while science had no immediate answer, Sarah believed answers existed. They just hadn't been asked loudly enough. Over the next few weeks, Sarah tried again and again. She drew maps of where her sick classmates lived, showing how they clustered near the factory road. She recorded how often Jenny coughed, how pale Tom looked, how Emma's headaches grew worse. When she showed Emma her maps, Emma whispered, "It really does look like a pattern." Sarah nodded fiercely. "Exactly! But no one wants to see it." Emma sighed. "Maybe they'll listen if you keep going." Sarah smiled weakly. "Then I'll keep going." Her persistence began to draw small ripples of attention. A librarian at the town library noticed her stacks of soil and biology books and asked, "Working on a big project?" Sarah explained, and instead of laughing, the librarian leaned forward. "You remind me of Rachel Carson. She wrote Silent Spring and changed how the world thought about pollution. She was ignored at first too." Sarah's heart leapt. "Really? She was ignored too?" "Yes," the librarian said, "but she kept going. And because she didn't stop, people finally listened." That night, Sarah copied the name Rachel Carson into her notebook and drew a small star beside it. Sarah now understood something important. Science doesn't always give immediate answers. Sometimes it hides behind long tests, official reports, and polite shrugs. But curiosity, the raw, stubborn refusal to stop asking, was stronger. She closed her notebook, whispered into the night, "If they won't listen, I'll make them. Even if I'm just a kid." Her voice was small, but her determination was not. Unbeknownst to the town, the quiet persistence of a 9-year-old girl had already set in motion a storm that would shake them all. For weeks, Sarah Elisabeth Miller carried her notebook everywhere, like a soldier guarding her most valuable weapon. Page after page filled with observations: sick classmates, yellow grass, poisoned streams. She felt like she was shouting into a storm, her voice drowned out by adult laughter, polite letters, and scientific excuses. Yet, Sarah refused to stop, and as fate would have it, someone finally listened. One rainy Thursday, Sarah's teacher announced a surprise. "Class, today we'll have visitors from the Green Earth Environmental Group. They've been traveling through small towns, teaching about nature and conservation." The moment the guests entered the classroom, Sarah sat straighter. Two young adults carried posters of rivers and forests, speaking passionately about clean air and water. Sarah's heart pounded. This is my chance. When the presentation ended, she raised her hand so fast it nearly hurt. "Excuse me," she blurted out, her voice trembling. "Can I show you something? It's important." The visitors exchanged a curious glance but nodded. "Of course. What is it?" Sarah ran to her desk and pulled out her notebook, flipping to the pages that showed her maps and notes. Her voice shook, but she pushed through. "There's something wrong near the old factory. My friends are sick. The grass is dead. The water looks poisoned. Nobody believes me. But I think something dangerous is there." The room fell silent. The students watched as the visitors bent over her notebook. One of them, a woman with kind eyes, asked, "You made all these notes yourself?" "Yes," Sarah whispered. "I've been watching for months." The woman's face grew serious. "Where is this factory?" 2 days later, the environmental group visited Willow Creek's factory site. Sarah, though not officially invited, tagged along with Emma, who insisted they watch from the edge of the field. The group carried equipment Sarah had only seen in books: metal probes, glass vials, and machines that hummed softly. They tested the soil, collected water, and took samples from the yellow patch of grass. Sarah held her breath, notebook in hand, scribbling their every move. At one point, one of the scientists whispered to another, their expressions darkening. Sarah leaned toward Emma. "Did you see that? They found something." Emma nodded nervously. "I think you're right." A week later, the environmental group held a small meeting at the community center. Dozens of townspeople gathered, curious about the outsiders' findings. Sarah squeezed into the front row, her heart pounding against her chest like a drum. The lead scientist cleared his throat. "Why tested the soil and water near the abandoned factory? The results are troubling. We found high levels of toxic chemicals, waste that has been leaking for years." Gasps filled the room. Parents looked at one another in alarm. Sarah's eyes widened, her breath catching. "It's real. I was right." The scientist continued, "These toxins can cause respiratory issues, headaches, fatigue, and other health problems, exactly the symptoms many of you have reported." The crowd erupted with murmurs. Some shouted, others demanded answers. Sarah sat frozen, tears stinging her eyes, not of sadness but of vindication. The truth she carried alone was finally spoken aloud. Her father stood, his voice shaking. "Are you saying my daughter, my 9-year-old, was the first to notice this? We've been living here, raising our families, and no one told us." The scientist nodded solemnly. "Children often notice what adults overlook. Sometimes their curiosity sees what our assumptions blind us to." Sarah felt her mother's arms wrap around her shoulders, trembling. "You were right all along," she whispered. The days that followed were filled with chaos. The local newspaper splashed the headline, "Factory poison leaks exposed, 9-year-old raises alarm." Reporters swarmed Willow Creek, eager to interview the little girl whose notebook sparked an investigation. Sarah hated the cameras, but she endured them. She spoke quietly, always repeating the same words. "I only wanted people to pay attention. I just wrote down what I saw." Parents grew furious with the council, demanding why inspections were ignored. Doctors lined up at clinics to test children for chemical exposure. The once quiet town buzzed with anger, fear, and disbelief. But through it all, Sarah felt strangely calm. The secret that had weighed on her small shoulders was finally out. As investigations deepened, the truth grew darker. Records revealed that the factory years ago had illegally dumped chemical waste in hidden pits. When it closed, no proper cleanup was done. Slowly, toxins seeped into the soil and water. For nearly a decade, families unknowingly lived beside invisible poison. Science, with its protocols and reports, had overlooked it. Officials had dismissed it. But Sarah, with nothing more than curiosity and persistence, had uncovered what others ignored. One evening, as the sun set over Willow Creek, Sarah sat on her porch with her notebook. This time she wasn't alone. Emma sat beside her, leaning close. "You did it, Sarah," Emma said softly. "You really did it." Sarah shook her head. "I didn't do it alone. The scientists proved it. I just saw it first." Emma nudged her. "But you didn't give up when no one believed you. That's why they came. That's why they looked." Sarah smiled faintly, closing her notebook. For the first time in months, her heart felt light. At a town meeting weeks later, Sarah was asked to speak. She stood nervously before the crowd, her small hands clutching the microphone. "I'm just a kid," she began, her voice quivering. "I don't know everything about science, but I knew something was wrong because I paid attention. Sometimes we think kids can't see what adults see, but maybe we notice things you miss. I only wrote what I saw because I cared about my friends, my school, and my town. If I can make a difference, then anyone can." The crowd erupted in applause. Sarah's cheeks burned, but her heart soared. She had learned something powerful. The truth may take time, but persistence can uncover it, even if the first voice comes from a 9-year-old girl with a notebook. The factory was fenced off. Cleanup crews arrived with heavy machines. Families were relocated temporarily. Health programs were launched for children who had fallen sick, and at the center of it all was Sarah, the little girl whose curiosity refused to be silenced. The dark secret, once buried beneath soil and silence, was now revealed, and with it came not only justice for Willow Creek, but a lesson for everyone: never underestimate the power of a child who dares to question. When the truth about the poisoned soil and water spread through Willow Creek, the town seemed to change overnight. A place once sleepy and content, where neighbors exchanged pie recipes and children played freely in the streets, suddenly became a hive of activity, questions, and determination. For years, the old factory had stood as nothing more than a silent ruin on the edge of town. Now it was the center of every conversation, the symbol of betrayal and neglect, but also the proof of what persistence could uncover. The first visible transformation came with the arrival of cleanup crews. Trucks rolled into Willow Creek, carrying machines that dug deep into the soil, tanks that flushed out contaminated water, and workers in white protective suits who looked almost alien to the townspeople. Children pressed their noses against windows, watching as men and women carefully removed barrels of rusted metal buried beneath the earth. Sarah stood at the edge of the site one afternoon, Emma beside her, as a crane lifted a corroded drum dripping with chemicals. Emma shivered. "We were playing near that spot last summer. Can you believe it?" Sarah hugged her notebook to her chest. "That's why I had to write it all down. It didn't feel right." The adults who had once dismissed Sarah now nodded at her with respect as she walked past. Some even whispered her name, as though she were part of the town's history already. For many parents, the revelation explained months, or even years of worry. Mrs. Parker, whose son Tom had grown weaker and slower at recess, broke down crying when the doctors confirmed chemical exposure. "All this time, I thought he was just fragile, but it wasn't him. It was this town. This poison." Jenny's mother held Sarah's hand one afternoon and whispered, "Thank you, sweetheart. You may have saved my little girl's life." Sarah felt awkward under their praise. "I didn't do it for that. I just wanted people to listen." But inside, she felt something new, something stronger than pride. She felt the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that her voice had sparked change. The town council, once so dismissive of her letter, now faced furious parents and demanding reporters. Their polished smiles were gone, replaced with shame. At a heated meeting, one council member admitted, "We failed you. We relied on old reports instead of investigating properly. We owe this child more than we can repay." Sarah sat in the front row, her small feet dangling from the chair. She didn't smile at their apology. Instead, she raised her hand. "When kids ask questions," she said firmly, "don't just pat us on the head. Sometimes we see things you don't. You should listen next time." The room erupted in applause, not just for her words but for the truth behind them. The biggest transformation wasn't in the soil or the water, it was in the people themselves. Suddenly, children's voices were taken more seriously. Teachers encouraged their students to share observations, no matter how small. Parents began to ask their children, "What do you notice? What do you think?" At the library, a new section was dedicated to environmental books for young readers. The librarian even pinned up a photo of Sarah with the caption, "The girl who reminded us to listen." Local schools started science clubs, inspired by Sarah's persistence. And every Friday, Sarah found herself surrounded by classmates asking, "Can we use your notebook idea? Can you show us how to keep track like you did?" Though she was still just 9 years old, Sarah felt older in ways she couldn't describe. She still loved sketching butterflies and asking endless questions, but now she understood something bigger. Curiosity had power. Her father, once quick to dismiss her worries, now sat with her at the dinner table and asked, "So, Professor Miller, what mysteries have you solved today?" His eyes twinkled with pride, no longer teasing but full of respect. Her mother, who once told her not to worry so much, now encouraged her. "Keep noticing, Sarah. The world needs eyes like yours." Sarah beamed but reminded them, "It's not just me. Everyone should pay attention. If we all look closely, maybe we won't miss things like this again." As the months passed, the poisoned soil began to heal. Fresh grass sprouted, where once only yellow patches stood. The oily sheen faded from the stream, replaced by clear, cold water. Slowly birds returned to perch on the fence, their songs tentative but real. For the children who had been sick, healing took longer. Some recovered quickly, running and laughing again at recess. Others needed more care, more time, but now their parents understood, and doctors provided real treatment. Hope bloomed alongside the grass, fragile but growing stronger each day. Willow Creek, once just another forgotten small town, began to attract attention from beyond its borders. Journalists wrote about the little girl who saved her town. Environmental groups used Sarah's story in their campaigns, reminding people that vigilance mattered, that even ordinary communities could uncover hidden dangers. A sign was erected near the schoolyard, Willow Creek, where curiosity sparked change. Some townspeople worried about the reputation, embarrassed that a 9-year-old had seen what they did not, but most embraced it. They began to see Sarah not just as a child but as a symbol of their town's resilience. Practical changes followed, too. The council passed stricter safety rules. Water sources were tested regularly. Community gardens sprouted, teaching children to grow clean food in healthy soil. Sarah often walked through the gardens, smiling at rows of bright vegetables. When younger kids asked, "Why do we have gardens now?" she told them simply, "Because we learned to care." The lesson spread beyond Willow Creek. Neighboring towns began inspecting their own abandoned factories. Parents everywhere encouraged their children to speak up. Sarah's small discovery rippled outward, transforming not just her home, but countless others. On the 1-year anniversary of the discovery, the town held a gathering at the school auditorium. Families, teachers, officials, and children filled the seats. At the front, a plaque was unveiled in honor of Sarah Elisabeth Miller, whose curiosity and courage revealed the truth and transformed our town. Sarah blushed furiously as applause thundered through the room. She stepped onto the stage, holding her notebook against her chest like a shield. "I didn't do this alone," she said, her voice clear. "The truth was always there, waiting to be seen. I just noticed it. Anyone could have. That's the point. We all have eyes, we all can care, and we all can make a difference. Please never ignore what feels wrong. Listen, question, and pay attention." Her words echoed through the hall, planting seeds in every heart. Willow Creek was no longer just a place with poisoned soil. It was a place where a child's voice reshaped the future. It was a town transformed, not by machines or politicians, but by the courage of a little girl who refused to stay silent. And as Sarah walked home that night, her notebook in hand, she looked up at the stars and whispered, "On to the next mystery," for she knew the world was full of secrets, dark or bright, and someone had to be brave enough to uncover them. When Sarah Elisabeth Miller first scribbled her observations into a worn little notebook, she never imagined the world would one day look back at those crooked lines as the spark of change. She was only 9, after all, a child who loved asking questions no one seemed to want answered. But her persistence, her refusal to silence her curiosity, became more than a victory for Willow Creek. It became a lesson that rippled outward, inspiring thousands far beyond her small town. At first, the story belonged only to Willow Creek. The townspeople whispered it at church gatherings, retold it at kitchen tables, and nodded proudly whenever visitors asked about the girl who saved the town. But soon, newspapers picked up the story. Headlines read, 9-year-old discovers hidden poison in hometown. Curiosity saves a community. A child's notebook uncovers toxic truth. Television reporters came next, their cameras capturing Sarah standing shyly beside the once abandoned factory. They called her brave, brilliant, even heroic. Sarah never liked those words. She would shake her head and say softly, "I wasn't trying to be brave. I just couldn't ignore what I saw." Her humility only inspired people more. Schools across the state began sharing Sarah's story with their students. Teachers stood before classrooms and said, "See what happens when you pay attention. Even a 9-year-old can make a difference." Children who once doubted their own voices now raised their hands more often, asking questions without fear of laughter. Parents, remembering how Sarah's warnings had been dismissed, began listening more carefully when their children said, "Something's not right." In some places, communities started holding listening circles, where adults and children shared their observations side by side. The lesson was clear: wisdom isn't always tied to age. For Sarah, life changed in ways both exciting and overwhelming. Letters poured in from strangers, children who wrote, "You made me believe I can change something too," and adults who confessed, "Your story reminded me not to ignore my instincts." Sarah kept them all in a box under her bed. Some nights, she would read a few before falling asleep, smiling at the thought that her little notebook had reached hearts she had never met. One letter stood out. It came from a girl in another state who wrote, "I'm 10, and no one listens to me either. But when I read about you, I decided I won't stop speaking. Thank you for making me feel less alone." Sarah pressed that letter into her notebook, knowing she had passed the spark forward. Even in the world of science, her story made waves. At conferences, experts debated how a child had noticed what inspections had missed. Some scoffed, but many admitted, sometimes data blinds us to what human observation sees. Dr. Lewis, the retired chemist who had once gently dismissed Sarah, visited her again. Sitting across from her at the library, he said, "I owe you an apology. I thought science had the answers, but you reminded me that science begins with questions, and you asked the right ones." Sarah only smiled. Maybe that's all science is, questions that don't give up. Willow Creek slowly healed, but Sarah's story lived on as more than just a local tale. Nonprofit groups used her example to show that small voices matter. Activists quoted her words, "If I stop, who will notice?" on posters and websites. Soon Sarah found herself speaking at small events. She stood nervously before crowds much larger than her classroom, clutching her notebook, and said the same simple message: "I didn't do anything special. I only cared enough to write what I saw. You can too. Anyone can." And that simplicity, ordinary curiosity turned into extraordinary change, was what inspired thousands. What truly moved people was not the discovery itself, but the lesson behind it. Never ignore your instincts. Sarah trusted the uneasy feeling in her heart when something didn't seem right. No one is too small to make a difference. Her 9-year-old voice carried further than any council report. A real change begins when you care enough to question. She didn't stop asking, even when the answers were slow or unwelcome. This lesson reached children, parents, teachers, and leaders alike. It reminded the world that vigilance often begins with the simplest question: why? One evening, a year after the discovery, Sarah sat beneath the oak tree in her yard, notebook on her lap. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in gold and crimson. She read through her earliest notes, the shaky handwriting, the circles around dead grass, the little sketches of coughing children. She laughed softly. Who would have thought these scribbles could change so much? Her father came out with 2 mugs of cocoa and handed one to her. You know, Sarah, your story didn't just save this town. It reminded us grown-ups to stop and pay attention. You woke us up. Sarah sipped her cocoa, her eyes thoughtful. Then maybe that's what everyone's job is, just to notice and not be afraid to say something. Her father smiled, and you reminded the whole world of that. As the years passed, Sarah grew older, but the story of 9-year-old Sarah Elisabeth Miller remained timeless. Teachers continued to tell it in classrooms. Parents repeated it to their children at bedtime. Environmental groups told it at rallies. It became a story not just about one town or one girl, but about the possibility that lives inside every person, child or adult, to see what others overlook and to care enough to speak. And somewhere, in towns Sarah would never visit, children opened their own notebooks, scribbling questions, circling mysteries, refusing to ignore the wrong they noticed. Willow Creek no longer bore the shadow of the poisoned soil. Instead, it bore the light of a lesson that inspired thousands. That truth doesn't always come from machines or titles. That courage doesn't always roar. It sometimes whispers through a child's pen. And that change doesn't always begin with power, but with persistence. Sarah, still just a girl, understood this better than most adults ever would. On a warm summer night, Sarah lay on the grass, her notebook beside her, staring at the endless stars. She whispered into the night sky, "There are so many secrets out there, and I'll keep looking." The stars twinkled back as if in agreement, carrying her promise into the vastness of the universe. And in that moment, the world seemed to know. The lesson of Sarah Elisabeth Miller would never fade. It had inspired thousands, and it would continue to inspire thousands more.